Ever wondered who and what is shaping Luxembourg? This is your Lux Unplugged podcast with your hosts, Adrien and Thierry.
Hi, I'm Adrien.
Hi, and I'm Thierry. This time we are welcoming His Excellency John Marshall, UK Ambassador to Luxembourg.
We thought having the ambassador on the podcast would be very informative at times during which the relationship between the UK and Luxembourg/EU is being completely reshaped, now with Brexit on the horizon. This episode was recorded on the 20th of September 2019, just a few days after the UK Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, paid his first official visit to Luxembourg.
So the timing couldn't be more perfect to meet with the ambassador.
I definitely agree, Thierry. The UK and Luxembourg have had a very rich common history and well-established links in the business world, and this especially in the financial services sector.
Indeed, John Marshall was appointed as UK Ambassador to Luxembourg a few months before the UK voted to leave the EU. We were very keen to hear his views on all the various developments that have happened in the last 3 years.
I'm definitely sure there's a lot to talk about. But now, without further ado, our interview with His Excellency John Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for joining us today. Could you go in a little bit in your background, what you study, and how over the years got to this point where you're now in Luxembourg?
Yeah, sure. I was brought up in a small village near Oxford, and I basically lived in this wonderful old house, 16th century house, for the first 18 years of my life. And it's actually quite sort of relevant, I think, to what happened next, in that my interest in sort of following the career that I chose was largely inspired by having an uncle who worked in the United Nations system, and he lived and worked with his family in places like Rwanda and Tanzania and later Iran. And when he came back to the UK, he would always call on us, and he would, bring presents, and I'd get regular postcards from my aunt. And this really kind of made me interested in the world outside the UK. And particularly actually in, for reasons I now forget, African politics, it might be, because I had a friend at school who came from Kenya. And I suppose at the time, I didn't really appreciate all the different careers with which you could actually work overseas. I knew you could as a diplomat, and that sounded interesting. So that's what I decided I wanted to do at quite a young age 16 or so. So I went to university, I studied modern languages there. In our system, it actually doesn't really matter what you study. You can join the Foreign Office, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So that's why I decided to apply, and fortunately I got in, and I've had a very interesting career since then.
What are the countries that you've been travelling to so far?
So I joined the Foreign Office straight from university, which is kind of what you did in those days. Now we actually take people, I think we actually prefer to take people who've been out and had some sort of different types of experience in the private sector or civil society or whatever. But in my day, straight from university. So I've actually been in the Foreign Office for 31 years. So after a couple of years in London, I was posted to Japan. I did 4 years back in London. I then went to Malaysia. I then came back to London for another 4 years. And then since 2007, I have been successively in Ethiopia, Senegal, which was my first position as ambassador, and then since 2016 here.
So looking back at your career, can you sort of describe seminal moments that you've been through? What's been the most marking episodes that you've had as a diplomat?
Well, I mean, the thing about life as a diplomat is it's an immensely varied career, varied in the places that you're working, as I've explained, but also very varied in the sort of type of work that you're doing. So when I look back on my career, I mean, there are things that, like, I've got terrible memories. There's loads of things I've done that I've kind of forgotten all about. But there are other things that I will never forget. So, just to take maybe one example from each posting. In Japan, I had an immensely varied job, but probably the standout moment was organising a visit by the Princess of Wales to Japan. This was in 1995, the first sort of official visit she'd made overseas since her divorce. And the Japanese just sort of loved her, and they were out in the streets in thousands and thousands for every event that we went to. And it really sort of showed the connections between the countries, through in part the connections between the royal and the imperial family. And that was an overwhelming moment in the sense of seeing how ordinary people can have a passion for, the relationship their country has with another country. In Malaysia, I spent quite a lot of my time working on human rights, particularly issues around the independence of the judiciary. But probably what I remember most was a project that we did to try and improve the experience of victims of child sex abuse in the criminal justice system, to make sure that they weren't sort of victimised for a second time. And then in my 2 postings in Africa, I spent quite a lot of time working on sort of conflict and political governance issues. I was very much involved in the efforts of the international community to support Somaliland in its elections at a pretty delicate time. And Senegal, I was also there for a slightly tense period, which ultimately led to a peaceful transition of power, which isn't something that happens all the time in countries in Africa. And also hugely enjoyed supporting British business in Senegal, particularly as it developed its oil and gas sector, and also supporting British business in agriculture in Senegal, for example. And then, of course, here in Luxembourg, it's been my 3.5 years so far have been dominated by Brexit.
I mean, obviously the culture in the UK and Luxembourg is very similar. Was there one particular thing about cultures that you really enjoyed? Example, in Japan or in Senegal? Was there a key moment where you thought, I'm really happy that I actually seen this?
Yeah, I mean, loads and loads. But for me, one of the most important things, if possible, is to be able to learn the language. Mm-hmm. And this is brought home to me, I think, most clearly in Japan, where I did learn to speak Japanese. In fact, I was trained for 2 years to speak Japanese.
It's so impressive.
Largely forgotten it, I'm afraid. But at the time, it was good enough to do most of my job. But Japan was a wonderful place to travel around. But at the time, and this is the early 90s, there wasn't a lot of English language to be seen, and very few people spoke English. And so I still have these mental images of walking into these traditional little restaurants in Japan. You walk through the door, and the owner sees you come in, and there's a look of horror on their face, because they are they don't speak English, and they're worried about how the next few minutes are going to unfold and the fact that they won't be able to sort of welcome you in the way that they would wish to, because you won't be able to communicate. And then when they realize that you speak Japanese, they are so relieved and so relaxed. They then sort of shower attention on you. They're sort of bringing you all these delicacies to try. And you get to see a different part of Japan than someone who just goes on a 2-week holiday without speaking the language. So I mean, that's been the real privilege of my career, I think, is having the time to spend in a country so you can really get to understand it on a sort of granular level. So you're not just visiting the main sites that you would do if you only have a week or 2 weeks. Obviously you do that as well, but then you're going to places that other people would never dream of going to. But you go to because you just have the time, because you're living there, you just want to do something different at the weekends. Then obviously the job also takes you to all the different corners of the country.
It's definitely a varied career that you've had so far. Now, Brexit, as we all know, is something that is very overwhelming Europe now. But in relation to UK and Luxembourg, do you see Brexit as an opportunity to strengthen ties, given that this podcast is about our country?
I do, yes. I mean, Brexit's an immensely divisive issue and a very emotional issue. And one thing I know how to do as a diplomat is to kind of see everyone else's opinion on these things. And I think, there are people who are struggling to sort of come to terms with, the reality, which is that a decision has been taken and the government is is implementing it. And there are a lot of people for whom this will always be a sort of a negative thing. I mean, the discourse is around lose-lose, and they struggle to see the positives. And then there are others who even if perhaps, they never liked the idea of Brexit. I'm not just talking about UK nationals, people who might have voted, but also Luxembourgers and other Europeans. Even if they don't like the idea of Brexit, they have come to terms with the fact that it's going to happen, and therefore they are focused on looking for the positives in it and ensuring that the future is a strong and productive one. And I am fundamentally very optimistic about the relationship between the UK and the EU and between the UK and Luxembourg. And essentially, the reason for my optimism is that, I believe that the values that we have in common are so strong, and the geography helps, we're so close, that we are always going to be part of a partnership, an alliance, to promote and protect the values that are important to us, to ensure the security of our continent, to trade together. But we're just going to need to do that in a slightly different way. Not everything will change. We'll still be working with our EU friends and allies in the context of the UN, in the context of NATO, but obviously we won't be there in the council meetings, in the working group meetings, and that means that we will need to engage with the member states in a different way. And perhaps that provides opportunities for actually sort of strengthening bilateral engagement. And the bilateral relations are very good between the UK and Luxembourg, not just at the government level, but what particularly pleases me is how strong the relationships are, for example, between private sectors, most notably in the area of finance, but also the relations between people, individuals, in the sense that you get so many Luxembourgers who study in the UK. We hope that will continue. London and the UK is so close. We have so many flights that Luxembourgers are constantly going over to London for the weekend. And what pleases me even more is not just staying in London, but going further afield. I have never come across so many people in any other country, for example, who have explored Cornwall. Luxembourgers always talk to me about Cornwall and always make me feel guilty because I think I've only been a couple of times. Clearly they are sort of regular visitors. And the British community here is sort of sizable in a Luxembourg context, and I think contributes a really positive, or makes a really positive contribution to life in Luxembourg. So there's that real strong base of private sector community relations over which there's a sort of the government links as well. And I hope what we will see is more sort of activity which is taking place in a bilateral context between the UK and Luxembourg.
For Luxembourg, the EU is a cornerstone of, I would say, the success that they've gone through. The financial sector has benefited a lot from London's contribution and support. So do you think, for instance, and it's a more specific question, that London's financial sector and Luxembourg can strengthen themselves after Brexit?
I certainly hope so. Obviously there are some unknowns here. All the focus at the moment is on, negotiating the terms of our exit through the withdrawal agreement. In my view, we spent far too much time doing that. It'll be great when we've left and we can start focusing on a more constructive agenda, which is the future relationship in all its different aspects, whether it's the future economic relationship, future security relationship, how we're going to cooperate in areas of sort of science, research, and education. But a key part of that sort of future economic relationship, obviously, is the extent to which we have access to each other's services, markets, including in financial services. So those are discussions to come. But obviously, we hope the relationship between the two financial sectors can remain very, very close indeed, because it has been, in our collective interest, in our common interest, that it's been so.
Going back more to Luxembourg as the initiatives that you've taken recently, you've highly promoted the hashtag LuxUKLinks series. What is this initiative about? What are you trying to achieve with this project?
So earlier I mentioned that whenever I've gone somewhere, I have tried to sort of immerse myself in the country. And obviously part of that is, understanding the history of the country, and within the history, our sort of shared history. So, and not just the history, of course, but the sort of, the relationship in the present as well. So, when I knew that I was coming here, I started to sort of read up and, learn more about Luxembourg and understand, some of the links between our two countries. And, after my arrival, I continued to do that. And then the idea came to me, why don't I sort of tweet some of these links with the hashtag LuxUKLinks for the benefit of others. And, I started doing that. And obviously some of the links were things that everyone knows, but some were quite obscure, things that people probably had never heard about. So it started off as being a social media project, tweeting, at one point I was doing 2 a week, I think, and then went down to 1 a week. And it got a good reaction. And then I thought, well, not everyone is on social media, particularly not on Twitter, which is what I use as opposed to Facebook. So I thought, well, let's make it more accessible. And we turned it into an exhibition, sort of travelling exhibition, just on pull-up banners, 23 of those. And for a year, that exhibition went on tour. I mean, at times I would show it here when I had big events. People could go into one of our sort of exhibition rooms and see it. But it was also shown in several communes around Luxembourg, particularly those communes that had links with the UK and which might have been included in the exhibition. And it was shown in schools, it was shown in a couple of museums here in Luxembourg, and then towards the end of this year, it sort of went on tour internationally and was shown at the University of Sheffield, which has this Centre for Luxembourgish Studies, at the Luxembourg Embassy in London, and also at the Foreign Office in London. And then as that kind of year was coming to an end, we decided to do a book of the exhibition, but include some additional links. So we launched that in May last year, I think it was. And then more recently, I've been doing a sort of column around LuxUKLinks on RTL. There are going to be some videos later, and I'm thinking now about maybe a second book, but rather than the first book was like a sort of catalogue of the exhibition, and this book will be in a more sort of substantial form. I'm nearly at 150 that I've tweeted out, so sort of twice the number that were in the first book.
What is the most memorable, top 3 memorable links that you've found out so far?
There really is something for everyone in this. And so there's lots of history, there's kind of modern stuff, there are quirky things about, references to Luxembourg in Harry Potter, for example. One of my favourite links, and it actually explains the picture that we use for the cover of the book, is the fact that these very iconic old bridges in Luxembourg, the one outside the window, currently under a chantier, the Albrug, the Passerelle, that, and then the 2 railway viaducts at Clausen and Pulvermullen, they were built by an English company called Waring Brothers in the sort of very late 1850s, early 1860s. That's one I particularly like. Another one I like a lot because it's about my profession is the fact that the UK was the very first country to seek accreditation specifically to Luxembourg. So back in the sort of, the 19th century, ambassadors, most of whom were then obviously based in The Hague, they would present their credentials to the King of the Netherlands in a sort of combined capacity of, the King of the Netherlands and Grand Duke of Luxembourg, I suppose. So one of my predecessors in the 1870s presented his credentials to the King of the Netherlands, and then a year or 2 later asked if he could go back and present them again, specifically in his capacity as Grand Duke of Luxembourg. So this request was relayed back to the authorities here, who sort of thought, that's a bit strange. And then they decided they actually quite liked the idea. And so that colleague of mine became the very first ambassador who was specifically accredited to Luxembourg. And a third, which I mention sometimes, is that the very first international air services between Luxembourg and another country were to the UK, not from Findle to London Heathrow or City Airport, as they are now, and other airports too, but from Esch-sur-Alzette, an airport that has disappeared, I think it's under a school, to London Croydon, which is also no longer a functioning airport, though I believe that the sort of the terminal building from the 1930s has been preserved there, so I might try and visit that at some point.
Now that you've been here for a couple of years now, what is your favorite thing about Luxembourg then?
I think the thing I enjoy doing most is exploring the country outside Luxembourg City. I mean, that's not to say that I don't enjoy my time in Luxembourg City, but that's where I spend most of my time. And I run and I walk, and I've enjoyed basically running and walking through every corner of Luxembourg. When I first came, I did decide that I would try and run around the borders of Luxembourg, which I did, and when I finished doing that, I realised I had run through about half of Luxembourg's communes, so I decided to run through the rest. So wherever I stopped, that's where I started, and it was a sort of continuing line of 750 kilometres throughout the country, which I did in sort of runs of between 20 and 30 kilometres each time. But a sort of different answer is, partly in a sort of professional context, is I just enjoy the fact that the smallness of the society, in a way, means that you can have very good relationships with, the people who you need to deal with. You bump into them in the street, ministers you see about all the time, politicians you're just walking past a cafe and they're there. Yesterday, a couple of embassy teams ran in the Vault business run. At the end we were just together, and then next to us there was a team of MPs from the CSV. It's easier to build those connections because it's just a sort of smaller, more accessible environment in which you're working. And I find that quite fun. I will never forget when I called on Xavier Bettel soon after my arrival, my sort of introductory call on Xavier Bettel just down the road in Rue de Congrégation. I came out of my call on Xavier Bettel, and there, walking up the street all by himself, was Jacques Santer. It's the sort of coincidence that happens in Luxembourg because of its size that wouldn't happen in Paris or London or Berlin, and I think that's a very endearing feature of the place.
Our listenerships that we want to reach are obviously from English speaking to French speaking, people who've been here for many years, but also Luxembourgish citizens in the UK. Do you have a specific message for them about the relationship between Luxembourg and the UK?
There's lots of reasons to be positive about the future. As of now, we don't know whether we're going to be leaving with a deal or without a deal, but whatever the scenario is, we have provided the guarantees to EU nationals, including Luxembourgers, so they can continue to sort of live and work and access healthcare and education and benefits in the way they do now. So there'll be very few ways in which their life will change. And I'm in regular contact with Luxembourg Embassy in London, and I often ask the question, well, how's the community feeling at the moment? And the Luxembourg community, I mean, it's sort of two aspects of it. You have a resident population, which is only about, I think, 800 or so, and then you have, in addition to that, about 1,200 students who are there. And my sense is that it's a well established. The resident population is well established, and they're taking Brexit in their stride. And I think that the relationship between the two countries is going to remain very, very strong indeed. And as I was saying earlier, the respective communities, including the Luxembourg community in the UK and the British community here, are going to be key to the future closeness and success of that relationship.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. Great to talk to you today. We definitely look forward to having you back on LuxUnplugged podcast for follow episodes.
Look forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to the LuxUnplugged podcast. Please share this podcast with friends and family and leave us a review on iTunes. Also, please don't forget to visit our website, luxunplugged.com. And see you next time.